Hi everybody, this is Johnny. I am sharing this workbook for the edTPA. You can find this workbook for you to use in a link below in the description. This workbook is Mathematics Assessment Task 4, and this is the commentary. In this you will find all of the prompts, you will find directions, suggestions from me, and you'll find starters for every single one of the prompts. Hope this will be useful to you. So let's get started. In Mathematics Assessment Task 4, you will write a commentary responding to the prompts below. Your commentary should be no more than 8 single-spaced pages, including the prompts. Attach the assessment, including prompts, used to evaluate student performance after the re-engagement lesson, no more than 5 additional pages, and, if necessary, a transcription of inaudible portions of a video or audio clip of a work sample, no more than 2 additional pages to the end of the mathematics assessment commentary. These additional pages do not count towards the commentary page limit noted above. So here is the first prompt, Analyzing Student Learning, Whole Class. Identify the specific learning objectives measured by the formative assessment you chose for analysis. My suggestions: best to look at the given math curriculum and copy the learning objectives in the teacher's manual. Otherwise, be clear about the learning goals that were assessed in the student work or activity. Your re-engagement lesson will be based on learning objectives that some students did not quite meet and need another lesson. My starter for you: the specific learning objectives measured by the formative assessment were, and then you state one learning objective. If you have others, you state another learning objective, and others as you need. So that one's pretty straightforward. Next one is at the heart of this task, so you need to do the next one really well. This is B. Provide a graphic, chart or table or narrative that summarizes student learning for the whole class. Be sure to summarize student learning for all evaluation criteria submitted in Mathematics Assessment Task 4, Part D. So that's where you set out what was measured in your assessment. Do give good time and attention to this. It sets up prompt C. So the prompt that follows this one is going to be all about looking at your narrative or at your table. My suggestion is to make a chart or a table. You'll see why. If you're working with younger kids, a narrative will be great. Best to organize your learning objectives so that they give attention to 3 types of mathematical understanding. This is important because this gets us back to prompt 1C. So the first is conceptual understanding, then procedural fluency, and then mathematical reasoning problem-solving skills. These are the 3 key ideas that need to be represented in your assessment. So to help you think about these: conceptual understanding. Students should be able to talk about or represent their thinking in words, pictures, and diagrams. These are the ideas in the math. Computational fluency. Students should show how they come to results in number problems using operations appropriately, adding, subtracting, and multiplying as the problem needs. And then problem solving and reasoning. Students should show or explain their strategies for solving problems. So this one's about the ideas, this is about the numbers, this is about strategies. And so we need to hold on to these 3 as the core focus of this task. In your rubric or table, or in your narrative, you want to describe what each means for your kids in the activity that you're doing. Set out how many students approached, met, or exceeded the expectation. If you are writing a rubric for this, start by setting out the meeting expectation as your expectation for the learning objective. So that's your baseline. So here's some examples. It's best to think about for how the math for each conceptual, procedural fluency, problem solving, and reasoning is described. So if we look at this first example, it's a strong example. You can see that conceptual understanding is described in emerging terms. Students show a beginning understanding. Proficient terms, students understand the connection. Exemplary, students show a deeper understanding. So you can see how conceptual understanding is leveled, but also pay attention to how much descriptive language there is about the math. So students show a beginning understanding of the connection between fraction multiplication and division. Okay? And you can see that's followed in the next one. Students understand the connection between fraction multiplication and division, understand the usefulness of common denominators for fraction addition and exemplary. Students show a deeper understanding of the connection between fraction multiplication, division, and division. Students show a deeper understanding of the usefulness of common denominators for fraction addition. So you can see that it's very specific about a level, beginning, proficient, exemplary, but also about the mathematics. The other piece that you'll notice is the numbers underneath. The 24 represents how many students were in the class, and the number before it represents how many people at that level. So 9 of 24 students were at emerging level concepts. 10 out of 24 were at proficient levels at the conceptual understanding, and 6 of 24 were the exemplary level for conceptual understanding. For procedural, 14 of 24 emerging, 7 of 24 for proficient, and for exemplary, 3 of 24. And then finally, problem solving, 11 of 24 at emerging, 3 of 24 at proficient, and 10 of 24 at exemplary. So you can see a number of things here. Most of the class in conceptual understanding met or exceeded. So 10 and 6 out of 24 did well by this. But you can see at procedural fluency, most of the class struggled somehow. 14 out of 24 were not able to find common denominators. And then proficient was not good, and exemplary was very few. And then down here you can see there was a split. Some kids, a good number of kids did not meet the expectation, and a number of kids were exemplary too. But all of this is information that's helpful in the next part of this task. Here's an okay example. I think the first one's the one you should shoot for, but you can see problem solving, procedural understanding, conceptual understanding, approaches and meets. Here's a generic one that you might want to think about. This is not specific to the mathematics, but this could cut across lots of different kinds of math problems, just about emerging procedural fluency, developing procedural fluency, proficient procedural fluency. And you might use this, and you might think about using and describing the math that connects to your task underneath. So, going to C, using examples from the summary chart, discuss the patterns of learning across the whole class relative to the three: conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, mathematical reasoning, problem-solving skills. Okay, so this is your summary chart. You want to talk about what you can see in this, and that's why it's useful to have the clear language, useful to have the levels, and it's useful to say how many students met what levels. You'll have much more things, good things to write about. So as I write here, you must refer to your table or chart from prompt 1B. You want to write 3 separate paragraphs, one for each. Again, conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, mathematical reasoning, problem-solving skills. In each paragraph, and this relates to the rubric. The rubric's going to ask you to do these things in particular. First one is describe what students did right, referring to your table or chart. Okay, so if we go up to the chart, you can see what students did right in proficient and exemplary, and you want to give examples from students' work, what you saw in a particular student's work, or the patterns too. So aside from describing what students did right from your table or chart, describe patterns of learning. Patterns of learning comes up in the rubric as well. So across students, a particular way many students went about solving a problem or misunderstanding a problem. So did right, patterns of learning, and then follow with describe what students did wrong, referring to your table or chart. And if we go back up, you can see, you can describe what was going on in any of these emerging categories. Okay, what were they doing when they did not quite meet that expectation? So in each paragraph, did right, patterns of learning, did wrong, and then you want patterns of learning for what they did wrong, using examples from student work. Okay, so here's some starters. Use as makes good sense. For conceptual understanding, In students' work, many students showed strength in conceptual understanding. The number of students who met or exceeded the expectation can be seen in the table above. You report this number. This number was, refer to the number in your chart. You follow with the pattern of learning in their work shows strength in conceptual understanding is. The pattern of learning in their work that shows strength in conceptual understanding is. Describe what they were doing in the math. So you've got conceptual understanding, pattern of learning, and a strength. Now you have to do the other side of it. In students' work, some students showed some misunderstanding of the conceptual features of the math. The number of students who met or did not meet or are approaching the expectation can be seen in the table above, and this is where you give the number of kids who didn't quite get to that conceptual piece. And then you talk about the pattern of learning. The pattern of learning in their work that shows conceptual misunderstanding is, and describe what they were doing in the math. So this is conceptual understanding, and you can expect we're going to do that the same for procedural fluency. In students' work, many students showed strength, so we got the strength. In procedural fluency, the number of students who met or exceeded the expectation can be seen in the table above. Now you report the number was, refer to the number in the chart, then describe the pattern of learning. The pattern of learning in their work that shows strength in procedural fluency is, and describe what they were doing in math. So procedural fluency and strength, followed by their struggles. In students' work, some students showed some struggles in procedural fluency of the math. The number of students who did not meet or are approaching the expectation can be seen in the table above. This number was, referred to the number in the chart. The pattern of learning in their work that shows missteps in procedural fluency is, describe what they were doing in math. So procedural fluency, strengths, referring to the chart, and patterns of learning. For struggles, the number of students, and the pattern of learning that fits with procedural fluency. Last one, problem solving and reasoning. In students' work, many students showed strength in problem solving and reasoning. The number of students who met or exceeded the expectation can be seen in the table above. This number was, making the reference, and then going to pattern of learning. The pattern of learning in the work that shows strength in problem solving and reasoning is, describe what they were doing in the math. So this is strength in problem solving. And you follow with the struggles, right? In students' work, some students showed some struggles in problem solving and reasoning and math. So struggles. The number of students who did not meet or are approaching the expectation can be seen in the table above. This number was, refer to the number in the chart, and go to pattern of learning. The pattern of learning in their work that shows missteps in problem solving and reasoning is, describe what they were doing in the math. So for problem solving and reasoning, you've got strengths, you've got reference to the table above, and you talk about a pattern of learning. For struggles, reference to the chart and a pattern of learning. And if we go back up to the prompt, remember, we want examples from the summary chart, so we're talking about what we see in our chart, talking about patterns of learning, okay, relative to conceptual, procedural, fluency, and mathematical reasoning. And I pushed you to write about what they got right and wrong because that shows up in the rubric. Okay, let's go to the next prompt. So let's look at 2, analyzing student learning, 3 focus students. From your analysis of whole class learning, identify one area where students struggled mathematically. Select 3 student work samples that represent the struggles in this area. These students will be your focus students for this task. At least one of the focus students must have specific learning needs, and examples are IEP, 504 plan, English learner, underperforming student, gaps in academic knowledge, or student needing greater support or challenge. You need to follow with the prompt, which is, in what form did you submit the work samples for the 3 focus students? So you can submit the work samples in written form, in audio files or video files. So this one's pretty straightforward. Just adjust the prompt. The starter is, the work samples for my 3 focus students are, and then choose one of the 3, written work samples, audio files, video files. Let's go to B. Analyze the 3 students' work samples and describe the students' struggles as they relate to the underlying mathematical understanding and/or concept. Cite specific evidence from the work samples in relation to mathematical errors, confusions, and partial understandings. So they suggest here, what do the students' errors tell you about their mathematical understanding? For example, if a student error occurs in a subtraction problem, then the underlying mathematical understanding may include regrouping, meaning of subtraction, and/or subtraction as the inverse of addition. The related mathematical understanding becomes the basis for the targeted learning objective goal for the students. So I'm going to suggest writing 1 paragraph for each focus student. Don't just bundle them all together. And then you want to focus on their struggles and misunderstandings related to the math on the assessment, not about their behavior or handwriting or things that are not about the math. Okay? Be careful with that. Some starters for you. In looking at Focus Student 1's work sample, we can see, describe the math that the student showed. In this, we can see that the student struggled with, misunderstood, was confused by, was not correct in, describe it. From this evidence, the student needs to improve in. Pretty straightforward. Go back over to the prompt. You're taking the student's work. Okay, you're working from the work sample. You're describing their struggle, and you're using specific evidence from the work sample. So you have to say what they're doing in the math. You want to write out what they were doing in the math. This is the part where it says, as can be, we can see. Okay, that's where you give the evidence. So that's Focus Student 1. Focus Student 2 is the same. In looking at Focus Student 2's work sample, we can see, describe the math that the student showed. In this, we can see that the student struggled with, misunderstood, was confused by, was not correct in, describe it. From this evidence, the student needs to improve in and describe it. And then lastly, Focus Student 3. In looking at Focus Student 3's work sample, we can see, describe the math that the student showed. In this, we can see that the student struggled with, misunderstood, was confused by, was not correct in, describe it. From this evidence, the student needs to improve in and describe it. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward here. Each focus student, their struggles, and then what evidence you have. A paragraph for each. I'm going to say that again, a paragraph for each, with lots of evidence. For C, if a video or audio work sample occurs in a grouped context, like a discussion, provide the name of the clip and clearly describe how the scorer can identify the focus student. So some marker, their position, physical description, whose work is portrayed. You want the reviewer to know who you're talking about, so you'll need to make sure that that's understood. So you want to name the clip and a starter, and you can do this for each focus student that you need to identify. In video clip or audio clip number, focus student, the number, can be identified by and describe how they can be identified. Let's go to 3. Developing students' mathematical understanding. Based on your analysis of the focus students' work samples, write a targeted learning objective goal for the students related to the area of struggle. So you've looked at your focus students' work. They will have things that they need to get better at. There was something they didn't quite do right in the first initial task. Now you have to set out a learning goal based on that need. So, as I say, look across your focus students. What is one common area of struggle that they have in common? What is one math topic that can be taught in a lesson to address this struggle? And starter, based on my analysis of my focus students' work samples, they struggle with, and then you describe what the common struggle is. Because of this, my learning objective for this lesson will be, write out the learning objective. So I give you some examples here. Students will build arrays with tiles to better understand multiplication. Another example, students will use a base 10 mat to solve problems in addition with regrouping. Another example, students will build fraction models to demonstrate equivalency. So the main thing here is you're justifying your learning objective by their area of struggle, but then you set out the learning objective very clearly. So what is it that you want them to do in the re-engagement lesson? And your re-engagement lesson can be focused on something very, very particular. It doesn't have to be the biggest lesson trying to teach 10 things. It could be one aspect, one particular need your students have demonstrated from the initial assessment from the task that started all this. So in B, describe the re-engagement lesson you designed to develop each focus student's mathematical knowledge in relation to the targeted learning objective or goal. Your description should include, and this is a list, targeted learning objective, goal from prompt 3A, state-adopted academic content standards that were the basis of the analysis, strategies and learning tasks to re-engage students, including what you and the students will be doing, representations and other instructional resources materials used to re-engage students in learning, assessments for monitoring student learning during the lesson, so like examples, pair share, use of individual whiteboards, quick quiz. And the suggestion is, before responding to prompt 4, you will teach your re-engagement lesson. This lesson may be taught with the 3 focus students one-on-one, in a small group, or with the whole class. So hold on to that last part in particular. It doesn't have to be a one shot. It could be each individual focus student in separate individual lessons. The 3 focus students just themselves or with a few other students, or they could be all together with the rest of the class, but you have to have the 3 focus students. Okay, do make a list here addressing each one, and the list is these: learning objectives, state-adopted academic content standards, your strategies and learning tasks, your representations and instructional materials, and the assessments you will use. So you can see very plainly the targeted learning objective for this lesson will be, use what you wrote in 3B above. The state-adopted content standards that matter to this lesson are, list these and focus on just a few, more is not better. The learning tasks that I will set out for my students will be, describe and include the teaching strategies you will use. I will use the following in my instruction, describe the instructional resources and materials you will use in the lesson. And lastly, to assess student learning, I will, and some assessment ideas, include informal check-ins, monitoring student work while they work independently, and any pair share, whiteboard work, quizzes, or exit tickets. I'm going back up here again. We're just addressing each one of these. Okay? Learning objectives, standards, strategies, representations, materials, and assessments. And that's what these starters do. Next, analyzing teaching. Cite evidence from the 3 focus students' work samples from the re-engagement lesson to support your response to prompt 4B. And for this, it's simply, in what form did you submit the 3 students' work samples from the re-engagement lesson? Written or work samples, audio files, or video files. Simply describe the form of your students' work samples. And the starter is, the 3 focus students' work samples are, and you complete it, written work samples, audio files, or video files. Let's go to 4B. Analyze the effectiveness of the strategies you used during the re-engagement lesson to develop students' mathematical understanding in the identified area of struggle. Consider the change in students' mathematical understanding or misconceptions in relation to the identified area of struggle when describing the effectiveness of the re-engagement lesson. So this one is important. Give it time and some detail. Okay? You want to focus on the effectiveness of the strategies, and you want to think about describing what changed in the student. All right? So this one is important. Give it time and some detail. You should focus on both the group that was taught in your re-engagement lesson as well as each of your 3 focus students. So the 3 focus students, absolutely, but any other students you might describe the change in their understanding as well. You want to use the word effective, and you want to be kind to yourself too. Share what students did not do well as what they did do well. The point in this prompt is the quality of your analysis, not whether your lesson succeeded or not. All right? So you can describe both. My students did really well by these were the strategies I think improved their understanding. I tried this strategy to improve their understanding, but it didn't quite work. This is why I think it happened this way. So here's some starters that will get you in that good place. Use more than once as makes sense. General statement about the group. So aside from addressing each one of the focus students, start by talking about the whole group of them as as a unit. Okay, so especially if you taught them as a group or in the whole class. Let's start this. This lesson involves students in learning about, refer to the learning lesson objective. I believe that the lesson was effective for most students because, describe evidence, what shows in student work. This improvement in understanding came about because, describe the teaching strategies you believe made the improvement. I believe students showed improved understanding of, describe, this can be seen, describe what students made or did that showed the understanding, and this is where you address the change part. This improvement in understanding came about because, describe the teaching strategies that you believe made the improvement. And to continue, in analyzing my lesson, I believe some students still struggle with, describe this. This can be seen, describe evidence from student work. I believe my teaching strategy, describe, was not as effective as I had hoped. My students were not able to make the most of the strategy because. So this is about something that didn't quite work as well as you might have wanted. Let's consider Focus Student 1. I believe this lesson was effective for Focus Student 1 in the following ways. You can see using the word effective. This can be seen in Focus Student 1's work, so evidence. The teaching strategies that best improved Focus Student 1's understanding were, so you're taking credit for what's working in your teaching, what was effective in your teaching. And you do the parallel now. I believe this lesson was not as effective as I had hoped for Focus Student 1. This can be seen in Focus Student 1's work here, where, so evidence. I believe the teaching strategy where I describe it did not improve their understanding, and give a reason why you think it did not work as well as you had hoped. So you want to continue with Focus Student 2, what was effective, what was not as effective, and you want to give rationale. For Focus Student 3, what was effective, what was not as effective, and you want to give rationale as well. And you want to give attention to change too. So for any one of these, Focus Student 1, you might describe something about the change in their learning. At the beginning of this unit, they understood something this way. At the end of the re-engagement lesson, they better understand this now. So you might add that to each one of these. So what was the change for Focus Student 1? What was the change for Focus Student 2? What was the change for Focus Student 3? Let's go to C. If a video or audio work sample occurs in a group context, provide the name of the clip and clearly describe how the scorer can identify the focus students. So telling the scorer who's who by position, physical description, whose work is portrayed. So you just need to name the clip. And my starter in video clip or audio clip number, focus student, whatever number of focus student you're talking about or focusing on, can be identified by, and then give a description. So those are all the prompts for task 4. Let's look at the rubrics. There are only 3 for task 4. Let's start with rubric 16, analyzing whole class understandings. How does the candidate analyze whole class evidence to identify patterns of student learning? Let's focus on level 3 to start with. Level 3 is what you're trying to get to minimally. You have to meet all the criteria within level 3 to make level 3. And level 3 for this one, about thinking about patterns of student learning. For level 3, candidate identifies what students did right and wrong related to conceptual understanding and one of the other two, procedural fluency or mathematical reasoning problem solving. So have to do conceptual understanding, but then either one of these two. My suggestion is you work all of them. So here's what I suggest. Conceptual understanding. In prompts 1B and 1C, identify students' strengths in the math you assessed and what they got right. Conceptual understanding, prompts 1B and 1C, identify students' struggles in the math you assessed and what they got wrong. So this is right and wrong for conceptual understanding. Procedural fluency, in prompts 1B and 1C, identify students' strengths in the math you assessed, what they got right. procedural fluency in prompts 1B and 1C, identify student struggles in the math you assessed and what they got wrong. So for procedural fluency, what they got right and what they got wrong. And lastly, mathematical reasoning problem solving in prompts 1B and 1C, identify student strengths in the math you assessed and what they got right. Mathematical reasoning problem solving in prompts 1B and 1C, identify student struggles in the math you assessed and what they got wrong. So again, what they got right and what they got wrong in problem solving. So if you were to do these, all 6, you hit all of these, but you also set yourself up for level 4, because look what level 4 says. Candidate identifies and explicitly connects patterns of learning, so this is where you have to talk about patterns, for conceptual understanding and the other 2 as well. So you want to try to do all of them. To get to level 4, emphasize patterns of learning in prompt 1C. I'll say that again. To get to level 4, emphasize patterns of learning in prompt 1C. So use that term again and again and again, patterns of learning. You'll see that patterns of learning is not described in 3, but is described in 4. So rubric 17, how does the candidate use student work to analyze mathematical errors, confusions, and partial understandings? For level 3, candidate uses evidence from the 3 focus student work samples to identify the specific student struggles, errors, confusions, or partial understandings. Okay, so this is looking at the student's work, and from that you're trying to identify the thing that they need to work on again in a re-engagement lesson. This is all about evidence. You need evidence from Focus Student 1's work that shows their struggles or confusions. You need evidence from Focus Student 2's work that shows their struggles or confusions. And you need evidence from Focus Student 3's work that shows their struggles or confusions. So think about this as 3. Address each one of them separately. I suggested writing a paragraph for each. To move to level 4, candidate uses evidence from the 3 focus student work samples to explain the student struggles, errors, confusions, or partial understandings in relation to the related mathematical concepts. Okay, so this is about finding evidence to identify the struggles. This is about explaining their struggles. To get to level 4, you need to move beyond just naming the student struggles. Describe what you see in the student's work that defines or makes the misunderstanding. And a suggestion for you, looking at this student's work, I believe that their misunderstanding comes from. So you're explaining what you think is going on with the student. So this is rubric 17, just one more. Rubric 18, using evidence to reflect on teaching. How does the candidate examine the re-engagement lesson to further student learning? For level 3, candidate uses evidence of student learning from the 3 student work samples to describe whether or not the re-engagement strategy was effective. Okay, so the pieces here are about evidence and about effectiveness of this re-engagement strategy. So evidence again, evidence again. I start with describe effectiveness for the whole group. And then I suggest describe the effectiveness of the lesson for Focus Student 1, what worked and did not work tied to teaching strategies. Describe the effectiveness of the lesson for Focus Student 2, what worked and did not work tied to teaching strategies. And for the last one, describe the effectiveness of the lesson for Focus Student 3, what worked and did not work tied to teaching strategies. Treat this one as having 4 elements to complete. Okay? Whole class and each of the focus students focusing on the effectiveness of the re-engagement lesson. For level 4, candidate uses specific evidence of student learning from the 3 student work samples to evaluate whether or not the re-engagement strategy was effective. And my suggestion here to get to level 4, set out descriptions of the math found in the work samples that plainly show how the teaching strategies were effective or not. Describe why you think the student came to a better understanding based on your teaching strategy. Or if they did not come to a better understanding, describe why you think this is so. So this is about the evaluation part, and the first is about specific evidence. Specific evidence, much more detail in regarding the student's work. And then for the second part, the evaluation, you're giving some description of why you think things came about the way they did. So those are the 3 rubrics. I'm going to share with you now an exemplar. Let's make it so we can see it. So this exemplar is a strong example. This is an actual submission, did well. It's really, really strong, so don't be intimidated. If yours is 80% the quality of the one below, you will be fine. 2 things to pay attention to: how the responses are absolutely specific to the prompts, and also how the key terms from the prompts are woven into the responses. So let's take a look. Start with the first one, analyzing student learning, whole class. Identify the specific learning objectives measured by the formative assessment. You can see the very first sentence does that. Okay, and students will be able to use doubling and halving to create arrays with the same area and different dimensions. And it continues, students will be able to identify the proportional pattern of doubling and halving. So great learning objectives, and then their connection to the standards. Okay, now the important part, the really important part, is the graphic chart or table. This one's really strong. So provide a graphic chart or table. You can use a narrative as well. And so B is about providing a graphic chart or table. You can see this one's pretty strong. Each of the 3 areas is defined: conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, communication, and mathematical reasoning. So in this, they have 3 levels: emerging, developing, proficient. Proficient here is meeting the expectation. This is, emerging is at the very, very basic level. Developing is a step up towards proficient, and proficient is meeting. You can also see that the number of students at those levels is defined here. And you can see for this first one, maybe 1/3 of the students met the level, but 2/3 of the students didn't quite get there. And this happens with procedural as well. A few students met the expectation for procedural fluency. And you can see the description here. Procedural fluency is described in general here, but then, specific to the levels too. Okay. And then for communication and mathematical reasoning, you can see that 6 students were at the emerging level, 16 of 27 at developing, and 5 of 27 at proficient. Do note that there's good descriptions of the expectations at each level here, and there's good description of the kinds of math that matters in this re-engagement lesson. If we go down here, this is not required, but this is an extension. The 3 categories: conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, and communication and mathematical reasoning, describing the students and the scores they received. And this person was able to justify student 1, student 2, and student 3 as having low scores, and justifying them as being their focus students. And here you can look across, you can see some students did better than others, some students really, really struggled, and this is a way of accounting for how students did on the initial task. So the next piece is using examples from the summary chart. You're looking for patterns of learning for these 3. So everything's going to be referring back to the table up there, starting with a paragraph for each. Conceptual understanding. So here this first paragraph is conceptual understanding, giving an overall case for the whole class, and then talking about patterns of learning for particular students. And you can see these numbers refer straight up to the table. And you can see a learning pattern keeps coming up again and again. Happens in the next piece as well: procedural fluency, a learning pattern, the number of students in that learning pattern again and again, paragraph on that, learning patterns and number of students from the chart, and descriptions of the kinds of math that they were doing. And then you see communication and mathematical reasoning, patterns of learning, numbers of students, and you can see that there's lots of good description here of the kinds of math and language that mattered to their understanding. So going back again to this prompt, you want to use examples from the summary chart, so the numbers, and then patterns of learning for each of these 3. And you can see how well organized it is here. Analyzing student learning for the 3 focus students. You have to talk about what form did you submit the work samples. And so this person said written work samples and text files. So you want to analyze the 3 students' work samples, what they struggled with, okay? And you want to give specific evidence from the work samples. Remember, this is all about setting up your re-engagement lesson. For the 3 focus students, what was it they struggled with? And you have to detail it. So you can see right here, each of the 3 selected students showed that they needed some support in conceptual understanding. Then naming the first student, focus student 1, and then you can see specific evidence, cite specific evidence, and talking about the struggles too. She scored in the developing category. She made the same mistake, misunderstanding. So you can see the focus student, specific evidence of their struggles. Focus student 2, what their struggles were. You can see it continues down here. And you can see specific evidence on question 1b. Student 2 also used, only used. Specific evidence again. For focus student 3, you can see specific evidence again. These are the things that show up in the work sample. On question 2, she was able to create proportional arrays, but then also the struggles. She was unable to clearly identify. She did not use multiplication and division, provided only 2 types of evidence. So we go back up here. Working from the samples, what were the struggles and what's the evidence? And you can see each one of the students was given good attention in this prompt. So let's look at 3. Based on your analysis of the focused students' work samples, write a targeted learning objective goal for the students related to the area of struggle. And you can see this person writes it straight up. They have a common struggle in conceptual understanding, and then the targeted learning objective for the students is students will be able to understand how doubling and halving are used together to manipulate an array without changing its area. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. For B, this is describing the re-engagement lesson, and you need to target all of these. So your targeted learning objective, which you wrote up here, your content standards, the strategies and learning tasks you set out, representations and materials, and then your assessments. And this person does all those things straight up. Learning objective, Common Core standards, strategies, tools, resources, materials, and then the assessments down here. This is a list, just go through it. It doesn't show up on the rubric, just do a good job with it. And then 4, in analyzing teaching, what form did you submit the 3 student work samples? And this person submitted written work samples and text files. B is much more important. Analyze the effectiveness of the strategies you used during the re-engagement lesson to develop students' mathematical understanding in the identified area of struggle. You want to consider the change. Okay? So analyzing the effectiveness. So proved to be somewhat effective. So they're allowing themselves to say it wasn't great. There were some things that worked and some things that didn't. And they start with some things that were effective. The lesson was very effective. And then giving evidence from the analysis. So everything purple is analysis, as evidenced in the consistent areas. Okay, and then some other area, the re-engagement lesson was also effective visually and kinesthetically. So giving some evidence from a student work. And then down here again, student 1's re-engagement lesson assessment showed that the re-engagement lesson was somewhat effective. And then giving some evidence about change as well. While this activity was effective in teaching students, it was ineffective in teaching them to represent the steps. And then again, describing actual students' work and how they were thinking and the changes of an understanding. And then again, evidence from student 3. So every one of the 3 focus students is given good attention. And then you could, down here, this activity could have been more effective. Overall, the re-engagement lesson. So this last piece is a general statement. Overall, the re-engagement lesson was effective in allowing the students to visualize how doubling and halving could be used proportionally. And then something about how it was ineffective. So you can see good work across the effectiveness and the analysis too. thinking about students' change, how they saw things, and how they see things differently after the re-engagement lesson. And the last one, there was no response to this one because this person did not use a separate video or audio file. So this is the exemplar. And remember, it's a strong example. If yours is 80%, it's going to be good enough. Remember that your responses should be absolutely specific to the prompts, and you should be using key terms from the prompts and weave them into the responses. And this was the workbook for Mathematics Assessment Task 4, thinking about the commentary. I went through every one of the prompts. I gave you some suggestions along the way about how to think about the prompts, and I also offered starters all the way along the way. I do hope this has been helpful and that you will do well with your TPA.